Session 2, Promoting a Clean Government. For this next session, let us move swiftly to the background of our moderator. His name is Dato Zainuddin Bahari. He's a graduate of University of Malaya. He holds a master's degree in public administration and a diploma in security and international relations. He had a long career in the civil service and had also served abroad. In 1985, he was seconded as a fellow in security and international relations with the Malaysian Institute of Strategic and International Studies. He retired from the civil service in 2000 as Deputy Secretary General, Ministry of Local Industry and Consumer Affairs, and as an internationally certified drug addiction professional. Interesting. He now serves as a consultant and master trainer with International Center for Certificate and Education of Addiction Professionals, IDCC. Dato Zainuddin Bahari is also a member of G25. Let us invite him to the stage and give a round of applause, please.
We are running rather late, and so let's start off. You guys can have your tea while the session goes on. Given the constraints of time, I will take just a minute or two to do the introduction. Welcome to this second session that is going to be devoted to the discussion on promoting a clean government. We all want a clean government. In fact, the desire for a clean government is universal. If we were to look back into the history of mankind, we will find evidences that advocate a clean government. 2,000 years ago, the ancient Hindu text, the Artha Shastra, provided for the definition of a well-governed society, where the various variables of politics, institutions, socio-economic are fused together into a functional whole. 1,500 years ago, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam received divine revelations, and within these revelations are Quranic injunctions which provides for good governance. Islam demands that a just society be created whose sole function is to ensure the welfare and the well-being of the people that constitute that society. In these last few years of our national history, we see little worthwhile evidence of good governance. This has bred unethical practices, and this in turn has brought about widespread corruption within our country. The powers that be practices bad governance, and as a consequence of that, they have destroyed rather than create values. What has brought about this callousness? Is it incompetence? Is it complacency? Is it disregard for human values? We need to find solutions. We need to formulate ways and means by which we can arrest this decline. We need to move forward. Now, it is for these reasons that G25 saw fit to organize this second public forum. We firmly believe that a clean government is a fundamental requisite to good governance. And to have good governance and clean government, we need to have in place the basic essentials of accountability, transparency, rule of law, independent judiciary, and of course, public participation. To discuss more on these and other issues, we have with us three very able and esteemed speakers. Before I call upon them to say their pieces, I will just run again very quickly on some of our ground rules. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes. I will allow the speaker to speak one after another, at the end of which we will then open the floor for discussion. We have 30 minutes for that. Now let me go back to the speakers. I have here a write-up of their brief biographies. I cannot do justice. They have, given the tremendous achievements that they have made, I cannot do justice by reading every word that is written here. What I can do, with apologies to the speakers, is to just highlight some of their career achievements. Let me begin with Dr. Terence Gomez, or Professor Dr. Terence Gomez. He is a professor of political economy at the Faculty of Economics and Administration, University of Malaya. He specializes in state market relations and the linkages between politics, policies, and business development. He has served as research coordinator of the UN Research Institute for Social Development in Geneva, Switzerland. He has had appointments with so many academic institutions, and his most prominent international book publications include Malaysia's Political Economy, Politics, Patronage, and Profits. And also in 2017, he published Minister of Finance Incorporated, Ownership and Control of Corporate Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite Dr. Terence Gomez to share his thoughts with us on government of GLCs, core players in the economy. Dr. Gomez, you have the floor.
I'd like to start by thanking G25 for inviting me to speak on some recent research we've been doing. My computer is not in front of me. I'd like to put up the slides, please. Today, I would like to speak on 3 issues: affirmative action as a public policy, the role of GLCs, and the third issue, political financing. I brought up these 3 issues because they're all related. I've also brought up these 3 issues because these are issues we have been discussing for a number of years, but the politicians refuse to discuss these issues. So it's us in civil society who have to put it back on the table and force them to deal with these issues in the run-up to the general election. In 2009, after the disastrous 2008 election for the Barisan Nasional, when Najib Razak came to power, he made certain promises. First, he said, no more racialized discourses, and so he had one Malaysia. The second thing that he said was we must put a stop to patronage and rent seeking, so he is going to introduce reforms on the financing of politics. The third issue which he said and spoke at length was the need for reducing the role of the state in the economy, the role of GLCs. And so he was advocating strongly privatization. And the final issue which he went at length on was on the issue of affirmative action. I'd like to take you all through this now. What are these 3 issues? Let me start with affirmative action. I want to say at the outset that the NEP, when it was introduced, was a good policy. It was a policy that the country needed. It was a policy that has in fact brought about a lot of good. We have seen now, because of the new economic policy, the rise of a middle class. We have also seen now the reduction in poverty. According to government's figures, it's about 0.6% from about 60% in 1970, a remarkable decline in poverty. And it's also brought about redistribution of wealth. But it was also a policy which was supposed to end in 1990. And the continued perpetuation of the NEP has also led to the abuse of the policy, including the rise of enormous, it's become a tool for patronage. It has also become a tool through which they can secure electoral support. It has also become a tool through which we have seen now perpetuation of racialized discourses, even though the objective of the NEP was to bring about national unity. Najib admitted when he came to power that there were certain problems in the economy. The first one was because of policies such as this, it was hampering domestic investments in the economy. The other issue which he brought attention to was that there was fear of expropriation of wealth by companies because of this policy. He also talked about the bypassing of entrepreneurial capacity because of this policy. He drew attention to the brain drain, which he attributed it to policies such as affirmative action. And he also drew attention to institutional decline, a quota system which has brought about serious problems in the public delivery system. His answer to all this was no more affirmative action. It was announced. in the press. And soon after that, there was a backlash. And with the backlash, he revised his policy. And he said, now we will have market-friendly affirmative action. To my mind, that was an oxymoron. Market-friendly affirmative action was the reason why the policy was not good in the first place. But what is more important is this. In 2013, after the general election, again, which was a disastrous outing for the Prime Minister personally, he then came back and he said, I am going to introduce my own affirmative action policy, the Bumiputra Economic Empowerment Policy. And he attributed this reason for this policy because, as he put it, where are the Chinese? They are not supporting the policy. Now, this is irresponsible because here, as you can see, I have highlighted here affirmative action ownership and control ownership patterns going back to the period from 1970 right up to 2008. I put this up because I just want to draw your attention to the outcome of affirmative action since the period of 1970. Look at Bumiputra equity ownership patterns. The figures speak a lot. From the period of 1969, the percentage was 1.5%. It had gone up to 19%, and from that figure, it has basically stagnated. By the year 2008, the last year when they gave us these figures, the percentage was only 20.8%. So what we are seeing here is only a 2 percentage point rise between the period from 1990 to 2008. A period of nearly 30 years, 20 years, we are seeing a percentage point rise of 0.2%. According to Najib, it's probably gone up to 23% when he introduced the Bumiputra affirmative action policy, the Bumiputra economic empowerment policy. Look at the figures for Chinese equity, especially for the last two figures. Between 2006 and 2008, the figures indicate a 8 percentage point drop for Chinese equity in terms of Chinese equity ownership. This is a monumental fall in just a period of 2 years. Again, as I said, we don't know what the figures are for today. But look also at growing foreign equity ownership. One of the key points of the NEP was to reduce foreign equity ownership. And they did quite well, as the figures indicate. Look at the figures between 1970 and the period 1990 when it ended. A massive fall in foreign equity ownership from 60% to about 25%. But since then, look at the growing rise in foreign equity ownership. The only community that seems to be doing well here is the Indians. They have gone up during this period. But before we clap our hands for the Indian communities, which have apparently gone up, look at the figure between 1970 and 2008. From 1% to 1.6%, a 0.5 percentage increase. And even that, I would argue, is probably attributable to concentration of wealth among a select group of people. But let's make this more concrete. I've put up here the figure for the top 50 companies in 2016, early 2017. And if you look at the figures in red, they are the GLCs. And the first thing that stands out here is the phenomenal presence of GLCs. And I'll come to that again. But look at the figures which I've highlighted in terms of Malay equity ownership. You have to go down to number 42 before you begin to see Malay equity presence. And that too, it's Syed Mokhtar. And Syed Mokhtar, as we know, is very well connected. And we come down to 46, Air Asia, well, most of us attribute it to Tony Fernandez, but there's also Kamarudin Merun, who also figures that. I'm putting up these figures to draw your attention to the fact that although we have had policies such as the BCIC and the NEP to try and increase Bumiputra equity presence, economic presence in the corporate sector, they have failed. What we have not seen is a debate about the public policy. Why is there no debate about this policy? My argument for this is that we came out with a book in 2013, just before the election, on this policy to precipitate a debate among politicians on this policy. And they didn't want to do it, on both sides. And the argument they gave me when I asked them, why aren't you debating this policy? They said they fear the loss of the Malay vote. There is no political will on the part of our politicians to debate this very important policy. And as I said, Najib, knowing these facts, even admitting there were problems in 2009, in 2013 introduced the BEE policy. And he then went on to say, I am going to get the GLCs to implement it. So let's talk about the GLCs. The GLCs are important. Can we have the next slide, please? The GLCs are important because here you can see, this is based on the book which we just published, Minister of Finance Incorporated. What you are seeing here is the enormous concentration of economic wealth in the hands of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. As you know, the Prime Minister is also the Finance Minister. And as you heard from Latifa earlier, and there is also enormous concentration of political power in the office of the Prime Minister. So here, what we are seeing is, if we look at these figures, the Minister of Finance has control of the major government-linked investment companies, and they in turn, can we have the next slide please? They in turn have control over an enormous volume of companies. Here we are looking at the 7 GLICs controlling the top 100 publicly listed companies, and just those companies, 35 of them, we have this figure in terms of GLCs. Can we have the next please? We are doing new research now on the GLCs. What we have not touched on, and which I'd like to present today, briefly, we'll present our findings very soon, is the fact that ministries, the 24 ministries in cabinet, also own companies. And here I put up just one. You can't see it very clearly. I'll give you the full picture when we have completed the study. Here, what you're seeing is just the Ministry of Rural and Regional Development. I put this up simply because this is the ministry, as you can see, enormous volume of companies, which is also mired in serious corruption. And it also has control of companies such as Mara, as you know, which has also been involved in serious allegations of corruption. The next slide, please. Here, as much as we talk about the ministries having control of GLCs, what of the 13 state governments? The 13 state governments themselves have control of GLCs. And here I'm only putting up Selangor. I put up Selangor simply because Selangor is probably the most industrialized state in the country. It is also a state in which has actively intervened in the economy. And here I can tell you Selangor, in fact, is much smaller than what we have seen in, say, Johor or what we have seen in Sarawak. So when we looked at the data, we were rather concerned about the voluminous amount of intervention by the state in the economy at many levels, at the level of the federal level, at the level of the ministries, and at the state level. What are the reforms that have been introduced to deal with the GLCs, given their ubiquitous presence in the economy? I should add that when Abdullah Ahmad Badawi came to power, he had a reform. He had a reform of the GLCs, but it was limited to only the 7 GLICs. You do see the GLCs, the publicly listed ones in particular, functioning well, which is why they remain among the top 20, top 30 companies in the country. But what of these vast number of companies at the state level too, and at the ministries? These are unquoted companies. I can tell you now, when the book Minister of Finance Incorporated was published, there was no desire to discuss the reforms of the GLCs. Another major issue that needs to be debated. Why are the politicians reluctant to speak about the GLCs, including in their own states? The GLCs have become a tool for the practice of patronage too. Since we are talking about state intervention in the economy, let me also bring up another issue, because you all have been talking about this at length. This is about state-state relationships, China in Malaysia. Here, if you can see the next table, I wanted to put this up because, can we have the next, please? The next table here, what I've shown you is just a diagram, or just a table of some of the investments by companies from China, basically state-owned enterprises. Also, their links with GLCs in Malaysia. Now, there's been a lot of concern about the forms of investment in Malaysia by these Chinese SOEs, but I would like to point out that different types of investments. There's state-private too, there's state-private, and there's state-state. State-private means SOEs from China working with private firms in Malaysia. And there are some of the examples here. State-private are examples of state, GLCs, SOEs, GLCs, and private firms. And then we also have the state-state, GLCs, SOEs. The largest, of course, are state-state. but there are variations. Unfortunately, I can't speak at length on this because we are getting into the research now, but this is an issue, again, we have to discuss. Why? Because when we talk about China and Malaysia, we are talking about two single dominant party states, two highly authoritarian states, who have extensive control over enterprises which are now, as I said, key players in the economy, including in the regional economy. Who holds them accountable for the way in which they involve themselves in the economies, regionally as well as domestically? Next, please. Which brings me to the next point, which I would like to discuss. When we look at the major projects involving the GLCs and SOEs, one of the main things that comes to mind is the fact that many of them are in infrastructure projects. Najib, as you know, likes to talk much of how he likes to be seen as the minister or the prime minister for infrastructure development, construction. And as you heard earlier in the panel discussion, there's much discussion of the GLCs taking over domestic firms. Although there was talk also of liberalizing the economy and supporting private enterprises in Malaysia. Many of the firms of late which have been taken over by the state include construction companies, linking it to the issue which is now here for us to discuss, political financing. If you look at political financing, in 2008, soon after, as I said, the disastrous election, one of the key issues that Najib talked about was reform of the financing of politics as a means to bring about an end to rent-seeking and patronage. Pemandu was asked to start the research on this, and I can tell you Pemandu started it. And soon after, not long later, it was shelved, quietly shelved. The issue came up again after the 1MDB scandal was exposed. And again, Najib came out and said, I'm forming a cabinet committee to look into this, and the cabinet committee came out with its proposals. But if you look at the proposals, there are serious flaws. I can tell you now, G25 led a group of 70 NGOs, and together we came up with a very comprehensive proposal. This comprehensive proposal included things such as not just legislative reforms, you also need institutional reforms. There's no point having new laws if the institutions that have oversight over these legislations do not have the autonomy to act independently. The new law by the government, which has still not been tabled, and I don't think it will be tabled, the new law on political financing will not be tabled before the next election. Why then did he go through the whole process? Anyway, even if we have the new law, the fact remains, what about the independence of the oversight institutions? Is the Attorney General independent? How independent is the Electoral Commission? Who will have oversight over the spending of funds during elections? And we do know that this is a serious problem. Look at the voluminous amount of money that was spent in the last election. And where did the money come from? And now we know, because of the expose on the 2.6 billion that flowed into the Prime Minister's personal account, that the money apparently came from foreign donations. Foreigners now dictating or spending money on our electoral process. What does this mean in terms of public policies when it comes to the quid pro quo for all the money that has flowed, if we assume that the Prime Minister is telling us the truth about this matter? So there are serious problems, as I said, that we need to discuss. The politicians are not willing to discuss this. Even the opposition, I would argue, although they have been very critical of 1MDB, where is the alternative recommendation to the government's recommendations on the financing of politics? I've been told now it's going to be in the manifesto, but I put this to them. The G25 came up with a very comprehensive proposal on recommendations on the financing of politics. Truly comprehensive. More than a year's amount of research into this. Why isn't that taken as the alternative to the government? I'm saying this to you, can we have the next please? Because there are a lot of issues we have to discuss, and it pertains not just to the Barisan Nasional, it pertains too to the performance of the opposition parties too. We need to have can we have the next slide please? We need to have a debate on these issues. This is my closing statement on the nature of public governance. How do we fix government to ensure a progressive form of state intervention? I don't profess to have all the answers. We're still doing the research, but I do think As we run into an election, this is an issue we need to discuss. What of state business ties? The fact of the matter, as much as we talk about the GLCs, and they being a ubiquitous presence in the economy, of the 1.2 million companies registered in this country, 99% of them, by the government's admission, are SMEs. What are the incentives in place to promote these SMEs? And I can tell you there is an entrepreneurial force on the ground based on our research on SMEs. How effective can they be when they're confronted with a strong state which has the capacity to expropriate policies based on issues such as affirmative action? Is that what's hampering investments in this economy, domestic investors? Is that what's hampering the poor R&D by small and medium scale enterprises to help them move up the technological ladder? So in terms of nature of public policies, we have, whether we like it or not, I know this is sensitive, I know this is uncomfortable, but we have to debate the BCIC and the BEE policy. We have to talk about the reform of the GLCs. It is happening both at the federal level and at the state level. There are too many politicians sitting on the board as board of directors of the companies of GLCs. What reasons do politicians have to sit at the GLCs? It's board of directors. And finally, the monetization of politics. This is a serious issue. I really fear for the next election in the sense that how much money will be spent in this election. This is going to be a difficult election. And because of the difficult nature of the contestation between the parties, how much money will be spent in this election? And how accountable will they be to us for the money that they will spend during the electoral process? Thank you.
Thank you, Terence. I cannot even begin to summarize all that has been said by Dr. Terence. He has given us tremendous food for thought. He has touched on so many issues, starting with the attitude of our own Prime Minister, who makes promises and then backtracks on these promises. He's taken up issues with regards to GLCs, ministries owing companies, and has touched on certain areas where we need to focus our attention if we are really serious about reforms. Our next speaker is Ms. Cynthia Gabriel. As I said earlier, I have here something that's written up with regards to their credential, which is very impressive. Again, with apologies to the speaker, I cannot read every word that's written here, so I will just highlight some of the more notable career achievements. Now, Cynthia is an advocate of human rights and good governance in Malaysia. She has spent most of her professional life in the field of advancing democratic freedoms, reforms, and policy change. She has served and collaborated with several UN initiatives on research work in the field of democracy and human rights, governance, and anti-corruption. She is currently an elected board member of the UN Convention Against Corruption. Cynthia has extensive networks with the local and global media. She is a founder member and a leading policy advocacy center. She is a founder of the leading policy advocacy center known as the Center to Combat Corruption and Cronyism, otherwise known as C4. It is my pleasure to invite Ms. Cynthia Gabriel, who will be speaking to us on public participation against corruption. Cynthia.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're still with us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you to G25 for this opportunity to speak before you. My topic today is what the keynote speaker and the panel before this had already touched on. It's about public participation in fighting corruption, public participation in promoting integrity, promoting human rights. Now, In the keynote speech of Tengku Razali Hamzah, I just want to point out paragraph 9. He actually spoke about the credence of good leadership, demands that these leaders are actually subject to public scrutiny. Now that's the first thing. The panel before this actually talked about the real concern that one reform after another was presented to us this morning. Now we know that there are serious problems in this country, but the important question that was asked is what will actually get the ruling party to listen to all of these reforms? Because these reforms are not going to benefit them. If there are going to be more checks and balance, if they're going to be a citizenry that is more empowered, that's not going to really work in their favor. So what actually is the scenario before us? Now I think Prof. Terence pointed out a lot of the problems in the way in which the administration runs today. Now we have a Prime Minister that is also the Finance Minister, and perhaps that is the first most glaring power abuse. And many people say, why can't the people just question it? Why can't parliamentarians actually speak about it in Parliament? Why can't we check the powers? Now my first point in this short 15 minutes is to actually speak about, next slide. Now, you need to do point by point, okay? Sorry, we have before us a corrupt regime. Now, the 1MDB scandal just broke everything. I mean, it actually showed us what 60 years of rule can actually do. And people actually say, you know, when I go overseas or talk to different friends, what's wrong with the Malaysian people? How can you allow 60 years of one regime to rule this country? And we must be, I think, one of the longest regimes that continues to be in existence today. If not the longest, I think we're the second longest. Now 60 years is a long time. It's 6 decades of rule. And that is what has allowed the 1MDB to take place. The 1MDB is the extreme of everything that has gone wrong. That 2.6 billion could be banked into a private bank account of a prime minister. You don't even hear this in the African countries that are ruled by despots. Now, that's not all. Now, we also know 1MDB was all about cross-border corruption, grand corruption, money laundering, and so much that had gone wrong with our public institutions. So that's my second point. It's really about how public institutions have failed to serve public interests. They have failed to protect us. And the public institutions are actually now protecting the people in power and the political leadership in power. So the question before us, I mean learned people like us before this room, and also the citizens out there, is what can be done in this kind of context. If you remember when the scandal broke, and now there are more scandals, of course, Mara Felder and so on, but when the scandal broke in 2015, we had a civil society organization, Birdsey, organize street protests, and even one overnight street protest. It was probably the biggest rally in the country, in the country's history. But immediately after the rally, the race and religion card was used. That's the trump card here. It's so easy to divide us, Malaysians, over our race and religious issues. I know there's many panels that will take place in the afternoon on this whole difficult problem of race and religion. But the interlinking of how Malaysians are divided, when we could have been united on an issue like governance and corruption, to actually bring our government to account. Now, right after that, there were images on TV3 and so on over, how come the rally was only attended by the Chinese and the non-Malays. How come? Where were the Malays? How come Malays don't believe in public assemblies, Malays don't believe in criticizing the government and so on. So they started to divide us. And of course, on the political end, there were issues when PAS was breaking away from Pakatan Rakyat at the time, and so the Malay, non-Malay, Muslim, non-Muslim divide became more pronounced. the use of repressive laws, I don't actually have to remind us that a civil society leader was arrested under detention without trial laws for organizing a public assembly. So what is my point here? The point is our space to express is actually closing in on us. Now there is this movement, this spoken language globally and locally about our space actually shrinking in, whether we realize it or not. It's a closing in of our civic space. So when we have laws that actually prevent us from expressing ourselves, laws that prevent us from assembling peacefully, now what expressions can we actually use that are legitimate, that are legal, that will allow the empowerment of citizens and the public to actually fight against corruption? Now it's well and good that our very respectable keynote speaker spoke about public scrutiny. There were important questions about how to hold our government to account and what will make this ruling party actually listen. Will it require regime change? What's so bad about change? Nothing. We have seen how Indonesia has actually prospered to be one of the primary democracies in this country. And its anti-corruption track record has actually been so impressive. Its economy is also rising. But the point here is about a two-party system. Will it be that citizens can actually finally choose a party or a coalition that can represent them? Will it also mean that citizens will have greater control over government-linked companies, over assets that are public assets that actually belong to us? What will it mean if citizens had greater control to actually bring back stolen funds that are now parked in all these offshore islands and in the UK and in the United States and so on? How will we actually be able to move forward after the 1MDB scandal? And now, shamelessly, even despite that scandal, we have more and more scandals coming up. And if we look at the Felda scandal, that's actually really terribly serious. But have we seen anyone's head roll on this matter? No. No. And so the issue really is, are the public institutions before us actually serious enough to get their work done? Or maybe that's not even their question, the question to ask, because the issue is really about, are they independent enough to protect our rights and to protect our interests? And one of the efforts that we worked on together with Ideas, the Bar Council and civil society, the one that Dato Nur Farida pointed out about the independence of the MECC, actually showed how important an independent institution should be. And it was the MECC, the previous leadership of the MECC, that requested the Bar Council and several civil society organizations to improve its independence. By itself, it recognized that it was not able to actually function independently, especially if it had to take the political leadership, the guys at the top, the guy right at the top, who actually hires and fires and actually puts the commissions in place. Now, unfortunately, Tan Sri Abu Qasim is no longer the Chief Commissioner of MECC, and he perhaps suffered. He was one of the many victims of the 1MDB scandal. But what I would say is that the reforms were so important that the minister in charge at that time actually promised that he would bring it up to Parliament, and that it was already formulated in the Aegis chambers and so on. And right after the 1MDB scandal and many months after that, we know nothing happened. It's on the back burner. So my question to the Prime Minister, his political leadership, if you want a fresh mandate from the people, the very least you could do is to tell the truth of what happened behind the 1MDB scandal. And we know they're not going to tell the truth. So the only way to get them to tell the truth is that we have to be strong. One rally, some arrests, these are bad things, but I guess we cannot actually stop there. And I'm not saying we should go to the streets every day, but I'm saying we need to keep the demand strong. We need to keep at it. It is not sufficient to actually say, so how to move forward after the 1 MDB? Post 1 MDB, what do? We are not post 1 MDB. We're stuck in a crisis. And we should actually tell the political leaders, and perhaps this is the best time to talk to politicians. Before the elections, they'll all listen to you. They'll say, yeah, sure, come. I'm going to the ground, I'm going to do this, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to talk to these groups. Because they also want to win votes. Now this is the best time for us to tell the political leadership and the opposition, if you want our vote, you have to function with integrity. You have to make pledges against anti-corruption, declare your assets, political financing laws, what do you do with GLCs? You have to respect our rights. Where's the rights to express, the rights to assemble, and the right to actually live as Malaysians. Now one other point, which is the other point, and I know I've spent quite a bit of time on this. Next slide. Next. Okay, is to actually talk about the age of social media. Now in many countries, social media, we know Occupy Wall Street, the Arab Spring, all these were actually assisted by social media. Facebook postings, Twitter postings, many things that actually assisted the energy on the ground, the eruption for a good government, the eruption for human rights, or it may be just the eruption for kicking out oppressors, telling dictators, I don't need you, I don't want you. Now, social media is quite powerful. We've tried a couple of things, and I think G25 has asked me to just highlight a few things. One of the many things that have been occupying the news is like our public officials, senior ones, junior ones, our politicians have been quite shameless about stealing our money. Now we know this thing about suspicious wealth, unexplained wealth, has been going on for quite a bit. And we also know this thing about politicians across the divide daring each other. I dare you to declare your assets. Declare how much money you actually have. What's your wealth like? And then they will show pictures of different politicians actually owning so on and so forth, many things. Now the latest one was about the former Menteri Besar of Kedah handing his a 2 million ringgit yacht to his daughter as a present and all that. And all that is like, oh, normal. It's normal in Malaysia that politicians actually are so rich. But if you actually know the salary of the Prime Minister, he doesn't even earn 50,000 ringgit a month. So with 50,000 ringgit a month or less, with perks and all that, maybe a bit more, then you wonder how could all this luxury property, these diamond rings, pink diamonds, all this, where did all this come from? So it's really about our role as citizens in actually tracking politicians that hold public funds to account. We need a system, we need regulatory mechanisms, but what can the public do? All of us have mobile phones. That's a great tool. The mobile phones come with camera. So with platforms like this, we called it Klepto Crazy Malaysia. It's just a small initiative, but it was about to get people excited to track only politicians in power, not to simply track all these rich businessmen and all that. Only politicians in power or senior officials that you know live in big mansions or around your house, driving big cars, or the sons of ministers actually driving Lamborghinis to universities and all that. Take picture, put it up online. That's the way to build a body of evidence, a way to name and shame, a way to actually get people a bit more excited. Now there is a danger in here that many people will be simply posting all kinds of things. So there's moderation issues and so on and so forth that needs to go in this. Now next slide. Next slide. Okay, this is another one. We have samples outside as well. Now one of the issues is many people have lost count, have stopped following the 1MDB scandal. But we know the one thing we needed to do as a civil society group, as many groups that actually work with public, is to actually engage young people in the fight against corruption. How can young students, young adults, even remember the hundreds of property, stolen property that were bought with 1MDB money? So there was an idea, hey, let's do a board game, like a Monopoly board game. So on the board is actually all stolen 1MDB property. And it's not our list, it's the list of the Department of Justice. So on the board is all the 1MDB property. You have important things. I mean, we have Raja Bomo cards, the chance and community cards, making it fun. But the lessons that need to be learned in there are things like you have to declare your assets, you pick up a card, or your asset is haram, so you lose all your assets and so on. Quite fun. You can pick up a set outside. The objective behind this was to actually familiarize people with the quantum of corruption, the quantity of money that was lost, the type of property that was bought, private jets, luxury yachts, everything, Monet paintings, and the list goes on. And most importantly is that, can you really be this rich and still have integrity? Okay, is it fine to be rich, but you do it in a clean way? So there are many lessons to be learned by playing games. And I think this is one of the things about public participation in fighting corruption, is we also need to be creative. It's not just about going to the streets. It's not just about doing important research in universities and so on, but how to have it relate with the average young person, with the average mind, with the average group of people that might be excited about something. And finally, another last example is next slide, yes. This is more at local government, and this is something that we have all experienced. We continue to experience longkang sumbat, dengue fever, roads that are not patched up properly, and then you ride a motorbike and you fall into it, all kinds of things. And this is about accountability at local government. This is about whether local council staff are corrupt, local council staff are malas, plain lazy, don't do their job, or they give it to contractors who don't bother because there's no need to be accountable, and so on. So a lot of the time, we talk about big federal issues, but really the change could be also at the local council level. The change could be at the state level. The change could be that citizens feel the quality of life is actually directly impacted by poor quality services and poor quality service delivery. So here's something else. It's not a new idea. It's something that we picked up from India. India has a tool called IPaidAbribe.com. It's a mobile app. So we created a tool called My Clean City. It's just about the same thing. You take a picture of a clogged drain or a road that's broken, you send it to the city council. The city council has actually tied their complaint system with this app to try to promote better service delivery. But the bigger problem was not just the platform, but about the culture of accountability in local councils. And the only way to improve that is by stronger public demand, stronger public participation, stronger, consistent, bold, courageous initiatives that we can take on, one by one, local government, state, and federal. Now, this is the most important time before I end. The general elections is before us. And as Professor Terence said, it's quite scary to imagine what's going to actually transpire, because Prime Minister Najib had admitted that out of all that stolen 1MDB money, $50 million was spent to win the last general elections. So I wonder where they're going to get more money to win more votes this general elections. Both All politicians are responsible, but most of all, I think we're responsible to keep our politicians in check. So good luck to us with this GE14. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cynthia. That was the most down-to-earth presentation if I ever heard one. And thank you also for all those very innovative ideas on how we as citizens can put pressure upon the powers that be so that there will be changes, given the fact that the general elections is only just around the corner. Cynthia has touched on many issues, many challenges that we face in terms of reforms that all of us are looking forward to. She touched on the corrupt regime, the control by the executive of the public institution, exploitation of race and religion, and of course repressive and unethical laws. I'm sure all of this will be food for us. I hope that you will be motivated to ask questions, to ask further questions when we come to the Q&A sessions. Let me now turn to our next speaker, and that is Dr. Wong Huat. Dr. Wong Huat is a thought leader who has written widely on elections and democracy, identity, politics, and civil society in Malaysia. He is a founding member of the Electoral Reform Lobby Coalition for Clean and Fair Elections, otherwise known as BERSIH. And he is also a leading expert in constituency delineation. Since 2012, he has been heading the Political Studies program at the Penang Institute. It is now my pleasure to call upon Dr. Huat to share with us his thoughts on public financing.
Thank you. Thank you, Dato Zainuddin. Thanks to G25 for inviting me to share my view. I'll take on from where Professor Terence has stopped. The NGO coalition led by G25, with leading inputs from Dr. Terence, had come up with a very comprehensive reform package on political funding. And Professor Terence's frustration is very much that this is not being taken on board. The ruling coalition is not interested to introduce much of the reform. Even their own version is not going to be implemented before GE14. The part that really important on going beyond what the government have in the G25-led initiative is on the institutional part, on making the oversight agencies impartial and effective. Now, the other part of Professor Terence's frustration is that opposition is not taking that further. And what if this election you do not see a change of government? Will we have anything? When the state agencies are not impartial, the opposition would resist most of this reform because, understandably, they would fall prey to selective prosecutions and so on. So what I'm going to talk about is one part that I think is pragmatic enough that we need to pursue, whether or not you will see a new government after GE14, because some of the reform should happen, and can happen and should happen at the state level. So my topic is basically paying political parties to be clean. And hello, next slide please. Sorry. Okay, I thought I directly control here. My main proposal is we should fund political parties based on the vote share in the most recent election. It doesn't, oh, all right, okay. There's a time lag. I think you're using the old slides. Okay, anyway, so, sorry, just follow me. I'm proposing to have funding for political party based on the vote share in the most recent elections, which means if the states were to pass this law immediately after GE14, this can happen. And with a qualifying threshold of 5%. No, you're using the old slide. Federal funding for federal elections, state funding for state elections. These are the proposed amount. Federal government, 110 million a year. Selangor, 30 million. Penang, 12 million. Kelantan, 9 million. Johor, 15 million. Kedah, 30 million. I did not go through all the states. I'm pointing out states where you have oppositions already in power, and states may have a change of government. And what I'm going to do next is to show why do we need to do this. Now, how can you keep political parties clean? Imagine the political parties are cats. How do you prevent the cats from touching the goldfish in the bowl? Two ways. One way is that you can assure the cat that it will get wet. And for fear of getting wet, the cat just have to stay away. The second way is feed the cat. Feed the cat until the cat doesn't have a need to go after the fish. We talk about money politics nowadays, really because in modern politics, in modern democracy, you cannot have effective representational politics without money. In election times, when you mobilize workers with all your flags lines, all your poster, everything is money. And there's no such things as free lunch. So where do the monies come from? It needs to come from somewhere. So when we talk about controlling, regulating political reform, okay, thank you, we are here. So there are three ways, the three main strategies. One is to control. You decide how much that the party can receive, from where they can receive, in what way, where to spend, and so on. The second way is transparency. You make sure everything is accountable on top of the control, so you know who may have an advantage, and in after elections, there's conflicts of interest, all those things will be made clear. The third one is actually substitution. If money is going to be a problem, then we shouldn't let the private financiers paying the bill. You should substitute private money with public fund money. And this is this particular part I'm talking about. Now, you put into the context why the political party are not interested. For BN, all these are bad. For the opposition, they're very worried about the first two strategies if you cannot guarantee state impartiality. They fear that it will only apply on the opposition, and while BN parties will be let go. So what I'm talking about is the last part, because this last part should work for everyone. We are talking about giving you money, and by giving you money, we may have a better chance that you'll be cleaner than otherwise. Whether or not the state institutions are becoming better. Now, there's objection to this idea of public funding. If you're a libertarian, then you would ask and say, why don't you just let people pay for their politics? Why should someone who believes in Islamic State have part of his tax money going to a secular party like DAP? Right? On the other hand, vice versa, if you believe in capitalism, why should your money go to a socialist party, for example? The reason is this. If you're going to let everyone pay for their politics, we're going to have two problems. One, people who can pay will have a better say in politics, and therefore you perpetuate inequality. Second, there will be a limited number of people who can pay, so we would have inadequate competition. The outcome to this When people pay, they want private benefits. You have two problems then. One is corruption, second is conflict of interest. So to get our taxpayer money to give to the party is really just to avoid this. Not purely for clean governance, that's what everyone talks about. But it's also important, what I want to stress, is to enhance multi-party competition. And this is where, with or without state impartiality, we need public funding. So in brief, public funding would have three benefits. One, preventing perpetuated inequality. Second, promoting competitive politics. Third, stamping out corruptions and conflicts of interest. These are three purposes that can be served with public funding. I'm going to draw the the lessons from Germany. Germany has a very bitter, tragic experience before the World War II with experimenting of democracy. It was the Weimar Republic, where the parties fight among themselves and it collapsed. So after the war, the German people took it very seriously. They are unlike many Malaysians. When we are not happy with the parties, we become very cynical. We talk as if like parties are all dirties, and those of us who are not in parties, we are better people and so on. The Germans are very pragmatic. They realize you cannot have democracy without parties. So if parties do not work, you have to find way to make it work. So one of the things they do is to give money to the parties. German parties get monies on two bases. One, on votes. They take into account of the vote share of the parties in the most recent elections, three types of election: federal election, European Parliament elections, and state elections, with threshold of 0.5% to 1%. And the rates is for every vote for the first 4 million votes, 0.85 euro. And then after that, 70 cents, 0.70 euro per vote. For mandatory contribution, anything that comes from membership dues, contribution by the elected representative, and other legally obtained donations, for every euro you get 0.38 euro. So what happens is that every party look at your vote share, look at your money, you submit a number that you want to claim. Well, all the parties, when they add up the number, the amount could be huge. The system actually have a cap and say every year we only give away 133 million euro. And so you take the claims applied by all these parties, calculate their percentage, and then divide the 133 million to all these parties. And this is the outcome. The color, the different pies, represent the party. Now, the outer pie, that shows you their share of funding. The largest one is CDU, the one in blue, followed by then SPD and so on. The inner layer is the vote share. Why I want to show this to you is basically to say, if you apply the German system, you realize that the funding part doesn't bring much difference. It's almost similar. My proposal that if we're going to adopt something like this, and Germany is one of the countries that Pakatan Harapan make reference to in their proposal for funding reform. If you're going to follow this, my proposal is to say, forget about contribution, because Malaysians are not known to be very honest when it comes to money. If you say we're going to give you money if you get donation, then you would have people throwing money just to get more matching fund from the state. And it's probably going to complicate the whole issue. Keep on the funding. Second thing to learn about from the German proposal is that the money would not just go to the party headquarters, but they go to the state branches as well. So in that sense, we talk about devolution. It's important not only thinking about the government, you need to make sure the parties have certain autonomy at the state level. So this is my proposal. purely based on votes, no contribution-based funding, total limit, maybe we can think about 0.04%. Why? Because 133 million euro, if you compare that with the German national budget last year, it was 0.04%. So let's say we take that figure. I'm going to show you what if we use a larger figure like 1%. And the threshold is 0.5% for both federal and state level. Lastly, as I said, the state funding is based on state elections, and then federal elections, you use federal money. This is the figure if we're going to use 0.04%. I show you the federal government and the 5 state government. Looking at the 2018 budget, if you go 0.04%, the federal money would have about 112 million. That's enough for the parties to run. But you use the same percentage on state, Selangor would have 1.25 million, Penang would have 500,000, Kelantan 0.38 million, Johor 0.6, Kedah 0.55. That's probably a bit too low. If you're going to take 1%, federal would have 2,800 million. That's too big. But Selangor would have 31, Penang 12, Kelantan about 10, Johor 15, Kedah about 14. So, what I propose is that for federal, we keep it at 0.04%. For the state, we take 1%, but we all round it down. Because when you set this, you're not going to tie it as a percentage to the budget. We are taking the budget as a reference point. So my proposal, therefore, is for federal government to have 110 million, Selangor 30 million, Penang 12, Kelantan 9, Johor 15, Kedah 13. So a party that, let's say you get 5%, in federal you get 5.5, in Selangor 1.5 and so on. If you get, let's say, 30%, then you get 33 million at federal level. Now, why this money is important? Let's go back to 1MDB. As Cynthia pointed out just now, 1MDB is more than just personal greed. It was necessitated by elections. Now, no way you can pay parties enough for them to buy votes. But even any party with integrity would still need monies to run. So we need to give them enough money so that they don't have to find other ways to get their money to run their politics. Here I put from 5% to 30%. The figure is important for you to consider because if you look at the last election, UMNO at the federal election, UMNO got 29%. That's a large party. One large party. We have 3 medium-sized parties, PKR 20%, DAP 16%, PAS 15%. One small party that is probably worthy of looking is MCA 8%. You put all this figure. What we are saying that if you have public funding, UMNO, based on the vote share, 1 year can have about 33 million. For you to run your parties and so on, honestly, that's enough. For you to buy votes will never be enough. And if you look at Selangor, let's say you look at a medium-sized party for PKR, 6 million. That's enough. You can have more money than even to give to your national headquarters. For Penang, let's say you look at DAP, that will get around 2 million. So these are realistic figures that we need to think about. Now, what about the entire reforming package? For federal funding, I support fully the comprehensive package from G25. They talk about restrictions of private funding, transparency, state impartiality, and so on. For state funding, if let's say you cannot change the government, you have the state. What the state can do, the state cannot change your AG chamber, cannot change your MSCC, you cannot do any of those things. But state can demand, the minimum is that you take my money, I need to know how do you spend the money. I can regulate how you can use the money. This is a part where we can demand accountability. So my simple proposal is taking a leaf from the comprehensive proposal and saying, if we cannot have it full, let's have something. We should not accept this argument and say, only when you have a change in Putrajaya, you can have reform. Because we wouldn't know how long. UMNO may just survive this next election. If they get 2/3, they can add seats, amend the constitution and add seats in the parliament. That would trigger another round of regulation, which may start as soon as end of this year. And that will make them even stronger. We may never change the government. So we should be realistic. We should aim high, going for a full scheme of reform, but even if we don't get this, we should demand reform at the state level. And I hope that G25 and the coalitions can pursue this. Thank you.
That is a most interesting proposal. I was wondering, how are we going to twist the government and the parties involved to have them accept this very innovative, revolutionary? Certainly it is realistic, and certainly it will go a long way towards reforming what needs to be reformed. I've just been informed by the organizers that we have only 15 minutes left before the luncheon speech. I'm glad that lunch has already been served, and we will now have our question and answer sessions while you are having your lunch, but I have to limit it to about 10 minutes. We will stay with the ground rules as indicated by the earlier session, in that everyone who would like to either comment or ask questions, kindly state your name and, if possible, where you are from. We are now open for questions. Are we too busy eating that we don't seem to be in the mood to be asking questions or to be listening to answers?
Yes, we'll be taking questions now. You'll see microphones at the middle and the side of the room.
Yeah, Professor. We have Professor Alatas.
Just a question to Cynthia. You were talking about, you were discussing how to create more awareness about corruption among people. You gave the example of kleptophilia. Now I was reading about initiatives done in some other countries. I think this was, if I'm not mistaken, Tanzania, where they established corruption clubs in schools to educate children about corruption. And since we were talking about the second generation, the next generation, what do you think, and it also relates to the larger issue, it's been said several times today, in the morning and also in the afternoon, that the ideas that are proposed by many of the speakers are excellent, but how do we, as the Chairman Moderator just said, how do we untwist the government into accepting these proposals? So we also probably need to talk beyond presenting very excellent proposals and suggestions. We should talk about what we can do to put pressure on those in authority to make the changes that we want to see made. So specifically with regard to corruption, maybe.
Will there be any more questions? Yeah, please.
being a big player in Malaysia, I wonder whether you've made any comparison with other countries in the region, for example, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and so on. That's all. Thank you.
Can we have one more question? Yes, Nancy.
Short question. The panel has given us deep insights into the real problem of money politics linked to it, GLCs and others. Chinua has got this idea of allocation of resources. My question is, if we cannot take action before this election to wipe out the possibilities or problems of money politics, what are the chances that the elections will be fair and free? Thank you.
Thank you. Just a quick response. I think these are very good ideas. However, we also know the restrictive climate in the country doesn't allow civil society groups to do these kind of things in schools. But one institution that can do it, or the government institutions that can do it, include the Anti-Corruption Commission, MECC, which I believe they have some programs in schools, including setting up integrity clubs with the Integrity Institute. Now, the question, I think the next question, which is very important, is how effective is it, and what's the impact of it? Because is it being run in every school, or is it just in urban schools, etc.? So we don't have enough information. We don't have any information on that. So it would be something quite important to ask. The previous MECC leaderships were quite open to us joining up with programs on that. So this one, we have to see how it works out in terms of their willingness to work with other stakeholders and so on. But it's a very good idea to start from young, because that is the prevention part that people know. I think one of the big problems is many people cannot identify clearly what's a corrupt practice, what's okay, is receiving gifts okay or not, you know, things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosia, for the question on the GLCs. I can tell you now that we are trying to complete the research on GLCs in Malaysia before we embark on the comparative dimension. We have finished the study on the federal level GLCs, the government-linked investment companies. We are now going into the study of publicly listed GLCs. We are also doing a study on the ministries that own businesses and the companies at the level of the state. We haven't really embarked yet on a comparative study because we ourselves have not completed our own research as to how things pan out in Malaysia. But having said that, let me just say this, that we have been in discussions, including with the OECD and other researchers on this topic. In the OECD meetings, what is interesting is when companies get together, they don't see state intervention through the GLCs as necessarily a bad thing. We seem to have that idea, state intervention is not good. This is an issue we have to debate, because I would argue the reason why we have a rather negative perception of state intervention is because of the nature of the state. The nature of the state that we have, as I said in the talk, is a single dominant party state which is hardly accountable to the electorate. But we have seen, including in other countries, government-linked companies through state intervention can have a very progressive role to play. They can be seen as developmental financial institutions of the sort that we have here too. Agro Bank, SME Bank, Export-Import Banks. These are development financial institutions controlled by the government, which play a big role in supporting the key player in the economy, the small and medium-scale enterprises. We have seen that the government, through GLCs, by intervention, can also create linkages between GLCs, MNCs, and SMEs. The Vendor Development Program, the Global Supplier Program, these were mechanisms that were created by the state through intervention to link SMEs with multinational companies and including through GLCs, to give them a wider exposure to the domestic market as well as international markets. The GLCs can play a big role in promoting R&D, research and development. And the volume of research and development in this country is very low for a country that wants to be a highly industrialized country. But R&D investment is also extremely expensive. And we can't depend, in particular, on the SMEs to do that. And again, the state has the role to play. And we have also sovereign wealth funds. A number of countries now have sovereign wealth funds. Norway has a sovereign wealth fund, which is said to be extremely progressive. Singapore has its own sovereign wealth fund, Temasek. We have Khazanah. So the state, when it intervenes in the economy through GLCs, can play multiple roles. And that is what we are looking at. I am not, for one, advocating a major intervention by the state in GLCs to be present in all sectors of the economy. I don't see that as its role. I see its role as nurturing domestic enterprises so that they can be big players also in the economy. But as I said, these are issues we need to debate. Having said that, since you mentioned Singapore, let me also say this. Did you know that Singapore too has a Minister of Finance Incorporated? They've got a company called Minister for Finance Incorporated, just like Malaysia has Minister of Finance Incorporated. Did you know, very few Singaporeans are aware that Singapore has a Minister for Finance Incorporated. It's interesting, isn't it? Again, another single dominant party state, highly interventionist. Why is there such limited transparency and accountability by the states? After all, Singapore claims it is squeaky clean. It is said to be squeaky clean. So why all this secrecy? This is what we want to bring to the fore. Yes, state can intervene. Yes, we make GLCs can be progressive, but they must be open and accountable, and we must be clear how they intervene and for what purpose they intervene. On the point raised by Councillor Ramon, can we expect free and fair elections? I can assure you, we are not going to get that. We are not going to get a free and fair election in the sense that the very process of gerrymandering that's going on, the malapportionment of the seats, the control of the media. Well, on the issue of money, I have to say that I do feel even the opposition has access to money which they're not disclosing enough of. I'm worried about where Barisan Nasional will get its money from. I'm worried about the implications of all this on the election. I'm worried about the vote buying, especially in rural areas. So am I expecting a free and fair election? No. I am rather concerned about these issues because, and this is my biggest concern, there is no political will on the part of both coalitions to deal with this issue properly. And I cannot understand why the opposition is not coming forward on this issue particularly, because it doesn't seem to be in their interest not to have transparency in the funding of the electoral process. And this is why I think the recommendations made by Huat are excellent, because at least through public funding there is transparency in terms of where the parties get their money from. Let me end by saying this. The recommendations that we have made on the financing of politics is not to stymie for parties from getting money. Parties, as Huat said, do need money to function properly. And running a party and a party machinery can be rather expensive. The question is, how do they get adequate funding so that they can do their work well, in an open and transparent manner? At the moment, it is not. And that is our biggest concern. Because if we do not know where the money is coming from, how will political parties, regardless who comes to power, how will they conceive public policies? Because how they conceive public policies also depends on who funds them. I, for one, may be very concerned about supporting a particular candidate if I know he is being funded by a particular businessman. And this is why we are asking for greater transparency during the election. Will we see it in the next election? No, which is very unfortunate, because the government itself had much time, 2 years, to prepare the recommendations of the reform of the financing of politics, and they didn't do it. Raises questions why.
Thank you. Prof.
Thank you. To Tan Sri Raman question, election fraud it is possible to defeat election fraud, but you need extremely high turnout, even gerrymandering. If you have high turnout and BN win, that's because people support BN. They cannot win by default. However, the challenge that what we really have today is that many people cannot see why they need to vote. The biggest challenge for next election is low turnout. If the turnout is going to be as low as 70%, I think we're likely going to have BN getting to the, and I say, very likely second round of rejuvenation will begin end of the year. We will be condemned for another 10 years. And by 2026, if you do not change the government, UMNO will replace Mexico PRI to be the world holder of longest ruling party. But how do we actually tell people to come out to vote? You cannot just scold people and say, I mean, we have been telling people and say, you know, it's dangerous if you don't come out to vote. But I think that's not enough. We need a bit more positive push. We need the opposition to offer us a stronger vision. I think they're doing better and better. You compare to a few months ago, they're doing better. But I think they need to do more. And I would think Selangor and Penang need to do more. Because we cannot always talk about until you change the government, then we have reform. We should have we need to have very innovative state government to push the boundary, to fight back the power, to introduce innovative reform. Public funding reform can be done by the states. And I urge the states to do it before election for a very simple reason. If you do it after election, you'll be accused of taking public money by BN. It would affect your legitimacy. But if you push it in now, you'll be pushing BN to say, what are you doing? Why can't you introduce anything? We are introducing something. This is why it's important that we need to see competition on reform. And if they want to, if they do not win, the opposition do not win federal government, they need more money to survive. They may win Kedah, they may win Johor. They need to have in place. What can they offer so that the party can compete honestly? People ask and say, when you talk about public funding reform, can you solve 1MDB? No. This is not about, if you're going to offer state funding, it's not about tackling 1MDB. It's to prevent the opposition from being corrupt. Because if they cannot find an honest way, sooner or later, they would have to take on some suspicious funding. I think that's something we need to deal with. The problem is not always just UMNO, it's the system. Thank you.
I think we will have to put a stop this right now because we are already running late. May I ask all the participants to kindly take a quick halt to their, take a quick pause to their lunch and give our esteemed speakers a round of applause. Welcome. Thank you.